Over the last 3 weeks, there have been some pretty amazing experiences and unique experiences that I encountered on my trip to the Holy Land. And throughout the next few weeks, and I hope to share some of those with you along with pictures. My hope is to put together a video presentation to kind of explain to you what we saw and what we did. But it's going to take some time to do that, so don't expect it soon. It might be a couple months. But one of the very unique experiences on this trip was actually on the flight back. From Tel Aviv to Frankfurt, I was seated next to an Orthodox Jew. He was actually on his way home. He was in the school in Jerusalem, and he was going back to New Jersey, to where he was from. I mean, I usually don't talk to people on airplanes unless they talk to me first. I'm not one to start up conversations, but I'm almost always in my collar. And so the response is sometimes mixed when you're in an airport or on an airplane. I was trying to sleep, but this young man was willing to talk. And so he asked me what I was doing in Israel. And of course, I told him, I said, I was visiting the Christian sites. And he said, so you're a Christian? I said, yes. In my mind, I was like, duh, collar. But being an Orthodox Jew, as I learned more about him, I realized that where he lived in New Jersey, they lived in their own little society in New Jersey. And so his actual main language was not English. His main language is actually Yiddish, which is a combination of Hebrew and German, and it's a combination of languages that's specific, I believe, just specific to a certain group of Jews, actually. And so he lived in this kind of closed-off community. His father ran a Jewish school, which they call a shiva. He was one of 8 children. He was studying in Jerusalem in a shiva. His older brother had completed school and was now married. And he was actually finishing school. He had one more year after this year, and then he was going to be married. But he didn't know to whom yet. They do arranged marriages in their community. And so in this closed little community, he didn't know anything about Christianity, literally nothing. I think this was the first time that he had ever talked to a Christian. It was the first time that he had ever heard anyone speak of Jesus as the Messiah. He had heard his rabbis speak about Christians who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and then their commentary on that fact, but he had never actually talked to a Christian before. And because his main language was actually Yiddish and English was more of a secondary language, he also spoke Hebrew in order to read the scriptures, read the Old Testament, because of course they don't have the New Testament. I used some words that to you and I are words that are in our Christian language and our Christian vocabulary that are not unfamiliar to us. And so I talked about the covenants being fulfilled. And he looked at me and he said, I don't know what you mean by that. And so I'm not sure if he didn't know what the word covenant meant because he read the scriptures in Hebrew. And so as he would quote scriptures to me, he was reciting it in Hebrew in his mind and even verbally, and then he was translating it into English so that I could understand what he was saying. And so the translations of the translation that I have is not necessarily 100% to the way that he was translating it in his own mind, as he had been taught by the rabbis in his shiva that had taught him. And so he didn't fully understand what it meant for Jesus to fulfill the covenants. And he said, can you show that to me and how that is? And I said, well, that's going to take about an 8-hour flight and a lot of scripture, and I don't have, my Bible was packed away underneath the plane. I didn't have it with me. And so I said, I can't do it right now. But I said, ultimately it comes down to the fact that the Messiah rose from the dead. As the Messiah rose from the dead, he then ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of the Father. And he said, yeah, we have people in the Old Testament in our scriptures that rose from the dead. I said, no, it's not like that in the Old Testament. Those people in the Old Testament will die again. Or Elijah or Moses, Elijah who was taken up in a chariot, or Moses who possibly was taken body and soul into heaven as well. But I said, the people that were raised from the dead, I said, this is different. I said, Jesus will never die again. many of those people will have to actually die again and eventually experience the resurrection later. It is literally the first time he had ever heard the gospel, the first time he had ever heard anything about Christianity. It was an experience that I've never encountered before. It was a very interesting experience to speak with him about the Gospels as someone who'd never heard it before, but also just interesting to hear about his life as an Orthodox Jew in this community that in many ways we would say is just completely closed off, and maybe we would even consider them naive. But I think the beautiful thing about his community is that they are literally all in. They have given their entire lives for what they believe to be the truth. What they believe, who they believe God is, and how he has revealed himself to them. And so their community is living literally all in for their God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23 from St. Paul. He says, "We proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." These ideas that I introduced to him, that Jesus was the Messiah, that he rose from the dead, that he is God, that he is the second person of the Trinity, which that word Trinity, he really didn't know anything about that, because of course they don't know the Trinity because it was not revealed to them in the way that the Trinity was revealed through Christ. All of these ideas, in a sense, were stumbling blocks for this faithful Jew who is unfamiliar with Jesus and what he has done for us. If he were to read more about this, his whole worldview would begin to be turned upside down. And his worldview about Christians, in a sense, in that moment, was transformed and changed because he had heard the gospel, a very brief presentation for the very first time. He heard me speak of God as three persons in one being, a concept that for us as Christians we hear over and over and over, and we hear it and we're just like, yeah, I know that. Of course, it's a mystery that we can't fully comprehend, but for him to even hear the basic idea of it is out of this world for him. He doesn't even have a general concept of what that is. It's literally completely new for him and for any Jew who hears that. I asked him if he thought that was blasphemy, and he didn't fully understand what that word blasphemy meant. But for Jews, it literally would be blasphemy to believe that God would become man and become like one of us. The prophet Isaiah in today's first reading says, "Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call him while he is near. Let the scoundrel forsake his way, and the wicked his thoughts. Let him turn to the Lord for mercy, to our God who is generous and forgiving. For my thoughts, not my thoughts, but his thoughts are not my thoughts. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways." This is God speaking. "As high as the heavens are above the earth, so high are my ways above your ways, and my thoughts above your thoughts." That first line of our reading today, seek the Lord while he may be found. We may, at times in our lives, think that God is playing hide and seek with us, or is just hidden and hasn't fully revealed himself to us. But he truly has revealed himself to us. He isn't hidden, he is actually fully revealed, and the revelation of God, the fullness of the revelation of God, has completely happened. And that revelation ended with the death of the last apostle. God has revealed himself, Christ has revealed himself in the scriptures, in our traditions, and in the magisterium, which is the teaching body of the church. The prophet goes on to say, "Let him turn to the Lord for mercy. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor my ways your ways." The prophet reminds us that our lives are meant to match up with God's. If we feel like Christ is hidden, if Christ is not revealing himself, then maybe we're not in the scriptures enough. Maybe we're not in the church's life enough, in the lives of the saints. We're not seeing him in the lives of the saints. Maybe we're not seeing him in our own lives because there's something in our own life that is not allowing ourselves to see him. Maybe it's some sin that we are holding on to. Maybe it's some unforgiveness. Maybe it's the lack of our ability to give ourselves over to something that is unseen. Seeking the Lord means that we must align our life with his and to put him before all things, before our family, before our work, before our kids, before all things that we do. God calls us to submit our mind, our body, our heart, and our soul, and to align it with God, who lives within us. St. Paul reminds us in his letter to the Philippians today, "For to me life is Christ, and death is gain." This means that we are called to die for this world, not to live for this world. Sometimes I think we make decisions that are for this world alone, and we don't think about the eternal consequences that those decisions make. When we educate our families and educate our children, are we educating for the next world, first and foremost, and more so than we are for this world? Are we training our children and our families to live for Christ and for Christ alone? This means that as we are called to die to this world, we are to detach ourselves from our disordered attachments to our own ideas, or our own beliefs, our own lives, so that we may be fully attached to Christ. During the season of Lent, we are called to pray, to fast, to give alms. But these aren't things that we are just called to do during those 40 days. These are the ways that God has given us to become attached to him, to be a regular part of our life, so that we may be converted, so that our hearts may be fully given over to God, that our hearts may be attached to him and not attached to the things of the world. When we seek God in every part of our life and allow him to work in our lives, we begin to see those transformations that he desires for us. That transformation that means to be a disciple of Christ. This Orthodox Jew that I sat next to on the plane, his name was Mordecai, could be seen as naive. But like I said, what I saw was a young man who has given his life over to God and has complete dependence upon what God is doing in his life, seeking to align his life with God and to live according to God's plan in his own life. And so we ought to be asking ourselves, even every day, what is God asking of us? Are we willing to put off the things in our life that keep us from God? Are we willing to humble ourselves in order to learn what the church teaches, even in respects to the moral life? Are we willing to actually study it and come to understand it? Are we actually willing to seek God where he may be found? In the scriptures, in the traditions, in the magisterium, all of that encompasses our entire life as Catholics. God calls us to do his work as we see in the gospel today. Whether it be in the first hour or the last hour of our lives, he's calling us to give our lives to him, to do his work, and to put ourselves in that place that he may call us to fulfill that work that he has in mind for us.